Dr. Roy Chowdhury will speak on today, urban vegetation in cities, neighborhoods, and parcels, the role of socioeconomic and institutional context. With this, Dr. Chowdhury, take it away.
Thank you very much. So thanks to everybody for attending the session, and particularly thanks to Dr. Song for inviting me to present in this session. And I will start with a round of acknowledgements right away to say that the research and approach that I'm presenting today is really the product and the process of a very large collaboration with really amazing contributors and co-investigators, particularly associated with a series of US National Science Foundation finance projects. In particular, I would like to thank three individuals, Dr. Grade, Dr. Locke, and Dr. Doble Morales, who have all contributed in particular to the development of the research that I'm presenting today. So I thought I would begin by sort of acknowledging a little bit of a wild card that I am in today's session and today's conference, indeed. And that is to say, you know, why on earth are we talking about US urban vegetation? And I thought I would reflect a little bit or share some reflections about how perhaps I fit into the broader themes and dices. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge and appreciate Dr. Song's reminder to us at the very beginning of today's symposium about the profoundness of the reach of human impact, right, in a world of 7.7 billion people at last count. And of course, I will go out on a limb to say that nowhere is this impact more acutely visible than in our cities. Indeed, more than half of the world's population already lives in urban areas, and that proportion is estimated to rise, according to the UN, to 2/3 by 2050. This rapid urbanization is associated with profound ecological change, and within that context, tree cover and vegetative cover more broadly in urban areas serve as critical providers of ecosystem services on the one hand, but also, interestingly, reflect very uneven development and social environmental outcomes as well. So in that regard, cities in the continental US certainly exhibit a broad range of diversity in terms of the ecoclimatic zones, just with the size of the American continent and the spatial scale of it. They also reflect very important differences in social and historical trajectories. So there's basically a lot of across-city variation, if you will. There's also tremendous variation within cities, particularly in the vegetative cover. As such, cities in the continental US have been the subjects of very large systematic, interdisciplinary, and long-term studies. And I will note the US National Science Foundation in multiple programs has been investing in long-term studies of cities as social ecological systems. So it is my hope that the results, and more importantly, the framework that I present here today can offer some insights to others that are probing the unevenness of social and ecological dynamics, particularly in urban vegetation in other global cities, particularly in Asia, right, where the pace and the scale of urbanization are really among the most rapid and dramatic in the world. So in summary, I'm going to summarize the presentation today at the outset. I'm asking the question with my collaborators, what is it that drives tree cover and plant diversity across multiple scales in US cities? And this work is motivated by several theoretical debates, both disciplinary and interdisciplinary, in urban socio-ecological systems, urban geography, urban political ecology, and land system science that have variably pointed out that urbanization is driving landscape simplification or homogenization on the one hand. But interestingly, there's a conundrum here because it is also seen to drive differentiation in cities, in particular, unequal distributions of ecological land covers and environmental amenities. So what we in a large collaborative interdisciplinary research group set about doing is to examine land cover across density and social gradients in 6 different US cities across the continental US, in order to compare relative tree cover, but also the spatial arrangement of vegetation and tree cover across neighborhoods and in individual residential yards and parcels. And jumping ahead to the findings, we basically found that urbanacity, housing stock, meaning the age of neighborhoods, the age of overall housing in neighborhoods, and social and economic status strongly shape tree cover outcomes at the neighborhood scale, approximately census block group scale. But in residential parcels, in much more granular levels, plant diversity was actually strongly linked to the presence of institutions such as homeowner associations and neighborhood associations, the influence of basically landscaping companies or garden stores on households' choices of plants to put into their yards, but also household social and demographic structure and yard management preferences. So this is the overall conceptual framework. I'm not going to elaborate on the different components of this. Suffice it to say that we are really undertaking a strong social as well as ecological integrated approach to this work. And we are adopting a multi-scalar approach to this work as well, ranging from the landscape to the neighborhood to the individual parcel. Our 6 cities are chosen to come from very different ecoclimatic zones of the United States, and that is by design. And in order to really evaluate the relative roles of ecoclimatic zone approximated by rainfall in this particular case as a proxy, in order to understand whether there is homogenization of land covers across cities, as is predicted by much of the literature, or whether there's actually environmental differentiation. And there's a lot of evidence for this homogenization thesis, and I will point in particular to the Christina Milesi-led study in 2005, followed up in 2009, that estimated that turfgrass lawns in the United States have far exceeded irrigated corn as the most predominant land cover across the US, which is really an astonishing finding. And, but of course, there are other ecological structures and functions that are of interest here. On the other hand, despite the sort of homogenization of functions and homogenization of land covers across cities, we also really see dramatic differences in cities and across cities in land covers. So these are some photographs from our fieldwork in these 6 cities that kind of give you a visible sample, a visual sample, right, of different kinds of yards in people's residential parcels. And you can see that there's quite a range here in terms of diversity versus investment in this sort of monoculture of turfgrass lawn. We undertook multi-scalar analysis, as mentioned before, and in order to do this, part of what we did was undertake object-based image analysis with high-resolution land cover supplemented by LiDAR data in order to produce very detailed maps of land use and land cover across and within cities. So on the left-hand side panel, you're actually seeing a neighborhood scale approximated by census block group boundaries distribution of grass versus tree, shrub versus impervious covers. On the right-hand side, we see a zoomed-in map of one particular parcel with, again, the different kinds of land cover that are represented here in one residential parcel. So with these sorts of data, the first set of results that I'm going to focus on is to actually talk about the results across the neighborhood scale across the 6 cities, right? So this comes from the object-based image analysis, high-resolution land cover classification on the one hand, but then to that we integrate data, secondary data from the US Census in order to explore how urbanacity, in other words, population density, but also other socio-demographic factors like median household income in neighborhoods, percent white, percent Hispanic populations, percent of owner-occupied housing units, median housing age, and so on and so forth, perhaps shape land cover, particularly tree canopy cover. On the panel in these box plots over here, what you have represented is tree canopy cover on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we actually have the different cities. So this is just a first glance showing that the city effect is incredibly strong. Right? So cities are statistically quite significantly different from one another in terms of how much average percent tree cover they feature in their neighborhoods. What's also quite remarkable is the fact that we have very strong nonlinearities in these relationships between tree canopy cover on the one hand, but also the spatial arrangement of those trees in larger versus smaller patches, the overall coefficient of variation of patches, and the shape complexity of those patches approximated, for example, by perimeter area ratios, so kind of some of the standard indices of interest in landscape ecology. We see really important non-linear effects. And I'm not going to go into every single one of these details, but suffice it to say that there are very strong non-linearities in relationships. We undertook some statistical modeling. In particular here, we're seeing the results of a generalized linear mixed model with fixed effects and random effects. And I'm just going to point out, I'm not going to focus on every single one of these dots, but I'm going to point out that we basically have, again, a very strong city effect. Boston and Baltimore sort of leading the pack in terms of how much relative tree canopy cover there is compared to the other cities. But we also have very strong predictors in the form of urbanacity or population density on the one hand, but also median household incomes, which really has a very strong non-linear effect on relative tree cover, such that with income we have increases in tree canopy cover up to about 100,000 or so median household annual income, and then tree canopy cover declines. So it's a really interesting finding. We have similar non-linearities in housing age, with basically tree canopy cover increasing with increases in housing age in neighborhoods until about 40 years or so, and then beginning to decline, and so on and so forth. I'm going to switch the scale of analysis now to consider what's going on not at the census block group scale or neighborhood scale, but now at the individual yard scale. So in order to do this, we undertook very detailed ecological surveys, plant diversity surveys in the field across 145 residential parcels, and coupled that with coordinated social surveys of the households that were managing those parcels, so either renters or residential owners. And this was done across 6 cities, the same 6 cities, and so on and so forth. And here we basically were interested in a lot of different outcomes, dependent variables, including percent tree cover and percent herbaceous or lawn cover at the parcel scale, but also actual species richness of plants, percent of cultivated versus non-cultivated plant species, percent native species versus exotic plant species, and then percent flowering plant species, because a lot of people really like to plant flowers in their yards. And so we're interested in what's going on at the species scale there. To that, we wanted to add a consideration in terms of the drivers of those outcomes. We wanted to control for precip and for city effects, but in particular, we wanted to look at neighborhood factors, including the presence or absence of organizations or association institutions, rather, such as homeowners associations and neighborhood associations that oftentimes in the United States can exert a lot of influence about what an individual homeowner can or cannot do in their yards. But also other things like median housing age in the neighborhood and the existence of either development projects in the neighborhood or conservation projects in the neighborhood. We additionally considered household factors like household size, parcel value, race, ethnicity, respondent age, and their preferences for different kinds of yard values, and then sources of information that they use for their yard management. So the first set of results I'm presenting here is a k-means cluster analysis, because we're interested in answering the question whether there were some emergent yard types, if you will, based on the plant diversity data alone, or the percent tree canopy cover alone. So we basically undertook a statistical cluster analysis with the first suite of variables that you see across the top left. And we found that indeed there were 2 very, very distinct clusters. And essentially the first cluster that you see in the red corresponds with more cultivated species, plant species in the yards. The blue cluster, the second cluster on the other hand, actually corresponds with overall greater diversity of plant species and more native species in people's yards. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically we also wanted to see how these clusters or cluster memberships, if you think about it, about a categorical dependent variable, which is essentially membership in cluster 1 or membership in cluster 2, the more cultivated species cluster versus the overall more biodiverse yards with more native species cluster. we wanted to ask a question, well, what explains membership in either cluster? And we had a bunch of hypothesized independent variables, the ones I mentioned a couple slides ago. And we basically conducted a random forest analysis to get at partial dependency plots. And I'll point out just a couple of these results. So across the top left, you see, again, the continued salience of the overall city type, which is the MSA. MSA stands for Metropolitan Statistical Area. Precip is also extremely significant. And we see that with increases in overall precipitation, we see an increase in the probability of belonging to cluster 2, which is the more biodiverse and the more native species yards. And very importantly, we see an incredible importance of the presence of rules as approximated by the presence of homeowners associations or neighborhood associations in the neighborhoods in which these households reside. So as you saw, the rules more imposed in the neighborhood and on individual house parcels, we actually saw a decline in cluster 1 membership probability, and we saw a greater predominance of cluster 2, probabilistically speaking. Please don't pay attention to the table on the right, but I wanted to explain that we wanted to follow up this categorical cluster probability analysis with more continuous variables as dependent variables. In particular, I was really interested in what's going on with overall yard species richness. So if we were to model plant species richness overall in the yard as a dependent variable, what are the independent variables that explain that? And similarly, what explains the proportion overall of cultivated species, the proportion of native species, and the proportion of flowering species. The same independent variables are used over here, so I'm not going to belabor that. But let me highlight one of those 4 models, which are generalized linear models in this case. And here, we're looking at total plant species richness, and what we see in the red are negative associations or inverse relationships. Rather, in the green, we see positive associations or direct relationships. So what we see is Boston is associated, all the Boston yards are associated with higher plant species richness relative to the base case of Baltimore, and certainly relative to the other cities in the set of 6 cities we considered. Again, homeowners associations and neighborhood associations are incredibly important, and they have a dampening effect on total plant species richness. Similarly, the overall housing age or neighborhood housing age, median housing age, and the census block groups have a negative relationship as well, or a dampening effect as well on yard plant species diversity. And we see an impact of race, ethnicity, particularly households that identify as white, were associated with higher plant species diversity overall. I want to present some cautionary notes here. So first of all, the plant surveys that we conducted
Dr. Roy Chowdhury,
yes,
we are pretty much out of time. So can you wrap it up in 1 minute, please?
Absolutely. Apologies. So the plant surveys don't have species abundance, only presence absence. Our sample does undersample low-income neighborhoods. And I want to mention that even though we have a comparative approach across the cities, they are not really integrated in a meta-coupling approach like Jacqueline presented. We are investigating alternative variables as well and causal narratives. And I wanted to end with some overall, again, connections to the pardon me. Okay, I'm not sure what happened to my screen share, but I wanted to end with some overall implications of the approach to particularly say that the kind of interdisciplinary design that we undertook, the multi-scalar design, and the spatially coordinated social and ecological sampling perhaps could be relevant for other studies in cities in Asia and beyond as well that want to look at urban vegetation as a social ecological system.